The pen feels heavier than it should, like someone slipped a stone inside it while I was driving here. I turn it in my fingers, feeling its weight press into my palm, realizing for the first time how strange it is that a single signature can change the course of a lifetime. Rain taps against the window of Harold Bennett's office. Not hard, just steady, like someone drumming their fingers on a table while they wait for a truth they already suspect is coming. I can smell old books, leather, and that faint citrus scent Harold always carries, something clean that does not belong to the storm outside. I shake my head because water will not help. There is only one thing that will, and I am not ready to do it yet. Not until I retrace how I ended up sitting here in this small office in Silver Ridge, holding a pen that feels heavier than grief. I said, I am just here to take my seat. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, but not enough that others could not hear. This ceremony is family only in the front rows. Evan wants to keep things intimate. Of course he would. I tried to smile, tried to keep my voice steady. I understand. I can sit in the back. I just want to be present. A few groomsmen nearby exchanged glances, the kind that said they wished they were anywhere but here. Sienna shifted her dress slightly, almost like she was positioning herself for the next line. I appreciate that you came. I really do. But with the photographers and the live stream and everything we planned, it is important we do not have distractions. Distraction, that word again, like yesterday, like something rehearsed. Behind her, Evan finally appeared. He straightened his tie as he walked, but his steps slowed when he saw me. His face softened for a moment, a flicker of the boy I once knew. But Sienna turned and looked at him, and whatever softness he had vanished. Mom! His voice was low, apologetic, but not strong enough to mean anything. Today is complicated. Maybe it is better if you let us handle this without extra tension. Extra tension, distractions, stress. Every word was another way to say the same thing. I place both hands on the table to steady myself. A breath goes in. It does not come out as easily. You are in the way. I swallowed hard. Guests around us pretended to read their programs, but I could feel their ears leaning toward us. Sienna folded her hands in front of her dress like a woman posing for a portrait. She said, "Please do not make this difficult." My pulse thudded in my ears. I thought of the nights I stayed awake with Evan when he was teething, of the mornings I packed lunches while juggling the night shifts that kept a roof over our heads, of the holidays I spent alone so he could travel with friends, of every quiet sacrifice I never named because I thought love was built on giving, not keeping score. But in that doorway, surrounded by people who had already decided what role I played in their story, I understood something with a clarity that hurt. I was not welcome here, not truly, not by the bride, and not enough by the groom to matter. My voice cracked only slightly when I said I will go. Evan took a small step toward me, but Sienna caught the movement and touched his arm lightly. Her nails were pale pink, glossy, perfect. Evan stopped. I turned before either of them could add anything. I felt eyes following me, felt pity from some and schadenfreude from others. My cheeks burned, but I kept my head up. I would not fall apart in front of an audience that had not invited me in the first place. Outside, the sun was harsher than before. The brightness made my eyes sting as I crossed the parking lot. By the time I reached my car, my chest ached so deeply it felt hollow. Harold notices. He waits another moment and says, "If it helps, tell me how all of this started." Sometimes clarity comes in the telling. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The music inside the venue swelled, faint through the thick walls. People cheered. Chairs shifted. The ceremony was beginning. Without me, I pulled a tissue from the glove compartment and pressed it to my eyes. I told myself to breathe, just breathe, the way I used to coach Evan through panic before a school performance. In for 4, out for 4. The steady rhythm kept me from falling apart. Eventually, I turned the key and drove out of the parking lot. The road stretched ahead in a long ribbon of heat shimmer and asphalt. The mountains rose in the distance, solid and patient, the way they always had been. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the car felt thick but necessary. My thoughts moved in slow circles, replaying every moment, every look, every word. I tried to brush them away like dust on a dashboard, but they kept settling again. Halfway home, traffic slowed near a construction zone. I rolled to a stop behind a pickup truck and allowed myself one honest thought. If this is how they treat me now, what will they ask of me next? It was the first time the question formed with real weight. And though I could not yet imagine the answer, something cold and unmistakable slid through me. I drove the rest of the way with my jaw clenched and my hands tight around the wheel. When I reached Silver Ridge, the late afternoon sun lit the front porch of my house in warm gold. But even the familiar creak of the wooden steps under my feet could not settle my heart. I set my keys on the entry table, walked into the kitchen, and froze. For the first time since I walked into his office, I looked directly at him. Not through him, not past him, at him, because he deserves to understand the truth before he watches me sign away a part of myself that has existed for 3 generations. The home screen of my laptop glowed from across the room. A notification pulsed in the corner. One new email. My eyes narrowed as I approached. The sender was Sienna. She had never emailed me before. I clicked. The message was short, hurried, clearly not meant for me. It referred to timelines, financial projections, and something that must be finalized before the wedding weekend. And near the bottom, almost hidden between lines of jargon I did not understand, there was a phrase that made my stomach drop. Her signature will simplify everything. I stared at those words until they blurred. The humiliation at the wedding was suddenly a smaller piece of a larger picture, and the picture was not pretty. I closed the laptop gently and stood in the quiet room without moving. The evening breeze rattled the window frame. Somewhere in the backyard, a bird called once, sharp and lonely. I felt the first thread of suspicion tighten inside me, thin but strong, and it was only the beginning. I stared at the phrase, her signature will simplify everything, until the letters lost their shape. And when I finally stepped back from the laptop, the room felt colder than it had moments before. I walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, then turned it off again without filling the glass I had meant to reach for. My hands would not stop trembling. The rest of the evening passed in a kind of quiet I could not shake. I moved through the house without really seeing it, passing framed photos of birthdays and school concerts and summers. Evan and I spent planting the garden together. Those memories felt soft and far away now, like they belonged to someone else. I slept poorly and woke even worse. Morning light crept across my bedroom ceiling in long stripes, but it did nothing to warm the knot in my stomach. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment before forcing myself into the kitchen. I had just poured coffee when my phone buzzed loudly on the counter. This didn't start with property lines or legal threats, I say quietly. It started 3 weeks ago, on the day I realized I was no longer welcome in my own son's life. Sienna's name, I let it ring, but she called again immediately, and again. On the 4th try, I picked up because some part of me already knew she would not stop. Her voice came through bright and smooth, as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. She said good morning in a tone that felt like a greeting card written by someone who had never experienced a real emotion. Then she said she and Evan needed to come by today because there were practical matters to take care of now that the wedding was over. I asked what practical matters meant. She let out a delicate sigh that sounded rehearsed. She said that living arrangements and financial responsibilities needed clarity. She said that my house, sitting on 32 acres, was too much for one person to maintain at my age. She said the best solution was for me to transfer ownership to them, since they were starting a family and needed space. I stood by the counter with my hand wrapped around my coffee mug so tightly my knuckles whitened. I asked her what made her think my home was up for negotiation. She kept talking as if she had not heard me. She said that if I signed the documents today, it would help their mortgage applications, their business expansion, their future. She spoke of my home like it was a gift card I could hand over without consequence. Then Evan's voice came onto the line, quieter, familiar, but strained. He said it would really help them. He said he knew I wanted the best for him. He said I had always been generous. I closed my eyes and felt something inside me shift in a way I could not name yet. I did not argue. I simply told them if they needed to talk, they could come by later in the afternoon. When the call ended, I set the phone down and pressed both hands against the counter. The wood felt cool under my palms. Outside, the meadow shimmered in early light, but I could not look at it for long because the thought of losing it, even in theory, made my throat tighten. I spent the next hour walking through the house, touching small things without really meaning to. The ceramic bowl Michael and I bought at a craft fair, the quilt my mother stitched the year Evan was born, the old boots by the back door still caked with dirt from last spring. Everything felt heavier. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Sienna standing on the porch in a fitted cream coat and sunglasses, even though the sun was only half out. Evan stood a step behind her, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes darting past me into the house. The words settled between us like dust drifting through late afternoon light. I glance at the phone again, still glowing, still insistently calling my attention to a bond that used to be unbreakable. Sienna walked in without waiting. She said she hoped I had paperwork ready. Evan followed slowly, looking at me like he wanted to apologize for being there, but could not quite form the words. I asked them to sit at the kitchen table. Sienna placed a thick folder in front of me, sliding it across the table as if closing a deal. She began explaining how transferring the deed would simplify things. She spoke in a tone she probably used with clients, smooth and confident, filled with phrases like financial flexibility and future planning. I looked at Evan, hoping to see something in his face that said he saw how absurd this all was. Instead, I saw the same tension he carried at 16 when he was dating a girl who controlled every part of his day. He had always wanted to keep peace, even when the peace cost him something important. I asked him if he truly believed I should give up the home I built with his father. He rubbed his forehead and said it was not about giving up anything. It was about doing what made sense. He said the land was too much for me. He said the house was too big. He said it gently, but each word scraped against something inside me. While he talked, Sienna pulled out a pen and tapped it lightly against the folder. She said that if I waited too long, their application for a business loan might be delayed. She said that timelines mattered. She said that she and her uncle had already drafted conceptual plans for the 5 cabins that could bring in serious revenue, and that the county might give preliminary approval soon. My chest went cold. I asked her what she meant by conceptual plans. Evan stiffened slightly, and Sienna shot him a look that shut him up before he spoke. I realized the truth in that moment, sharp and undeniable. This was not spontaneous. This was not a gentle suggestion from a newlywed couple. This was a plan made long before the rehearsal dinner, a plan that required me to step aside. I stood up slowly, pushing back my chair. The room seemed to tilt, even though I was steady on my feet. I told them I needed time to think. Sienna crossed her arms and said time was exactly what they did not have. She said any delay would hurt the business. She said obstacles were not helpful. Obstacles, another word polished to hide its cruelty. Evan finally spoke louder, frustration creeping into his voice. He said he was tired of being pulled between two women who refused to compromise. He said he just wanted a future that made sense. I leaned back in the chair and let the memory surface, slow and heavy, like a river rising after rain. 3 weeks. It feels like 3 years. I looked at him and felt something inside me crack in a quiet, final way. I said I had spent his entire life helping him build a future that made sense. Sienna scoffed softly, and Evan's shoulders sank further. A long silence followed, not peaceful, not reflective, sharp. I walked them to the door because I needed space to breathe. Sienna paused at the threshold. Her smile stretched thin. She said she hoped I would come to the right decision before complications arose. Then she put on her sunglasses, as if the world outside was too bright for her to face without armor. Evan lingered a moment longer. He looked at me, really looked, and for a second I saw the boy I raised, the one who built forts in the living room and asked me if clouds ever got tired of holding rain. But he said nothing. He only gave a small nod and followed his wife. I closed the door behind them and leaned my forehead against the wood. My breath came out shaky and uneven. The house was silent again, but now the silence felt different, not comforting, not familiar, heavy, like a warning settling across every room. I turned and looked out the window at the fields stretching toward the tree line, the land that held so much of my life, the land my mother tended and my husband loved, the land Evan had played on as a child, climbing rocks and chasing shadows of hawks across the grass. It seemed impossible that anyone could think I would sign it away. I pressed my hand against the glass and felt the cool surface steady me. For a long moment, I did not move. Then slowly, I turned from the window and walked toward the back of the house. Somewhere deep inside me, a quiet certainty had begun to take shape, growing stronger with each breath. Whatever was coming was bigger than yesterday's humiliation, bigger than Sienna's polished threats, bigger even than Evan's disappointment. And I could feel it rising already, steady as a storm building behind the ridge. I stepped away from the window and walked down the hallway with slow and steady breaths, trying to push the weight of that afternoon out of my chest. It did not leave. It only shifted, settling deeper. By the time I reached the back door, the pressure had grown into something sharp enough to make my ribs ache. I slipped on my shoes and stepped outside because the house suddenly felt too small to hold everything I was feeling. I tell Harold how I drove to Denver for the rehearsal dinner, excited and nervous, the way mothers get before their sons get married. I tell him how I wore the soft blue dress Evan once said made me look comforting, the way I did when he was little and climbed into my lap during thunderstorms. I tell him how I waited outside the ballroom, listening to laughter echo inside, thinking any second my son would come greet me. The air was cool and clean, the kind that rises off the fields before the sun warms them. My land stretched out in every direction, quiet and patient, as if waiting for me to remember who I was. I followed the worn path toward the fence line, letting my hands trail along the tops of the weeds that had grown tall after the early summer rains. The earth smelled of pine and dust and a hint of last night's storm. By the time I reached the old gate at the edge of the property, my pulse had steadied. I leaned my elbows on the top rail and looked out toward the ridge. It had always calmed me, that open space. Michael used to say, the land breathed for us when we were too tired to breathe for ourselves. I stood there long enough for the sun to tip higher through the clouds, then turned back toward the house. I knew what I needed to do next. June lived 2 houses down, though around here that meant a half-mile along the gravel road. She was already on her porch when I pulled into her driveway, a mug of tea in her hands, and her hair pulled up in a way that made her look softer than she admitted she was. She waved me forward and said she had been expecting company. I asked how she always seemed to know when I needed her. She only shrugged and said a woman learns to read silence better than noise. We sat in the small screen porch overlooking her vegetable beds. The fan overhead hummed, lifting the scent of basil and mint from the planters. For a few minutes we talked about simple things, because sometimes the heart needs a running start before it can carry its heavier truths. But eventually she looked at me with those steady brown eyes of hers and asked what happened. I told her everything. The rehearsal humiliation, the wedding door closing, the phone call that morning, the demand disguised as a request. The thick folder Sienna had placed on my table as if my home and land were a formality waiting to be completed. And then the email I had read the night before, the one that hinted at something planned long before I had even driven to Denver. June listened with her hands wrapped around her mug. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she blew out a long breath and set the mug down on the little wicker table. She said she had heard some things around town. She said Liam, the uncle Sienna bragged about, had been meeting with someone from the county planning office. She said she had overheard talk of luxury cabins and high-yield rentals and easy profit in the foothills. She said people believed Evan's family land was the perfect location and that the couple was confident they would secure the property soon. My throat went tight. I asked her how long she had known. She said she did not realize the land in question was mine until now. She said she was sorry. She touched my hand when she said it. The gesture nearly broke me. But it was Sienna who stepped out first, and Sienna who blocked the doorway, and Sienna who looked me up and down with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I asked her if she knew anything else. She hesitated, then leaned back and said that someone had mentioned Sienna was in deep debt, credit cards, wedding expenses, maybe something with her influencer business. Nobody knew for sure, but the rumor was she needed financial leverage quickly and that marrying into property would help solve some of her problems. I sat frozen. I felt the betrayal like a physical thing, spreading heat across my ribs and then draining into a cold pit in my stomach. Not just about the land, not just about the wedding door, but about the idea that my son had walked straight into the arms of someone who saw him as a stepping stone. I told June I was worried Evan truly believed this was normal, that he did not see how he was being used. She nodded slowly and said sometimes love makes people stupid, but sometimes fear makes them blind. She said Sienna struck her as someone who used both. We sat quietly for a moment. A blue jay landed on the railing before darting off again. I felt the wind shift against my shoulder, carrying the smell of fresh soil. Eventually I stood. June walked with me to my car. She touched my arm and told me I had more strength than I realized. I did not feel strong, but I thanked her. Driving home, I kept hearing her words about the county planning office, about the luxury cabins, about the confidence Sienna had that she would secure the property soon. The gravel crackled under my tires as I pulled up to the house again. I walked inside, and the silence felt sharper now. My eyes landed on the kitchen table where the folder from Sienna had rested earlier that morning. I had moved it to the counter before leaving, but even with the cover closed, it felt like it was staring back at me. I reached for my laptop and opened it again, not to reread Sienna's email, but to give myself a task, something practical to hold on to. I typed in the words County Planning Department, Silver Ridge. Search results popped up. Deadlines, applications, zoning requirements. I skimmed them slowly, absorbing just enough to know how serious this could be if I did nothing. A knock at the front door startled me. I walked slowly to answer it, and there was Evan on my porch, without Sienna. His shoulders were slumped more than usual, and his tie was crooked as if he had pulled it off halfway before giving up. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside. Harold listens without interrupting, his hands folded over the documents as if guarding them. He stopped just inside the living room and looked around. I could tell he had something rehearsed, something he had practiced saying in the car. His voice shook slightly when he spoke. He said he knew things got heated earlier. He said he did not want me to worry. He said Sienna was under stress and meant well. He said the plan for the cabins was an opportunity for all of us. He said everyone would benefit. He said it like it was a gift, not a demand. I asked him gently if he understood what giving up the land meant. He nodded and said it would still be part of the family. He said he would make sure I always had a place there. He said I would not lose anything. I felt my jaw tighten. I asked him if he remembered running across those fields when he was 7, pretending he was a ranger protecting a forest. I asked him if he remembered when Michael built the little tree platform for him and how he had insisted we have a picnic up there, even though the wood was still rough. I asked if he remembered the winters when the snow came up so high it covered the fence posts, and he used to climb the drifts with his red coat flapping behind him. He lowered his eyes. He remembered. I asked him if he truly believed this land was something I could hand over without losing a part of myself. He did not answer. I waited. But the silence between us became a boundary he did not cross. Not with words, not with understanding. Finally, he sighed and said he did not want to argue. He said he and Sienna were moving forward with their plans and hoped I would support them. He said he would come back tomorrow to get my signature. He asked me to sleep on it, like this was a matter of paperwork, like this was a decision made with a clear head instead of a wounded heart. When he left, I stood in the doorway watching him walk to his car. He did not turn back. Even when he reached the end of the drive, he kept his eyes forward. My phone buzzes again. Evan's name lights up the screen. His 27th call since Monday. I do not pick up. I have not picked up any of them. I swallow hard, remembering the sting of those minutes. But the office around me blurs for a moment. I close my eyes, letting the rain fill the silence. I closed the door softly and stood with my hand on the knob. The house felt heavier now, filled with a kind of quiet that was no longer stillness but warning. I turned and looked again at the meadow outside. The sun was lower, painting long shadows across the grass. It looked peaceful. It looked unchanged, but nothing was the same. I pressed my palm flat against the wooden door and breathed in slowly. Something inside me shifted again. A slow rising certainty that whatever was happening here was not going to stop unless I made it stop, and I could feel the first shape of a plan forming at the edges of my thoughts, faint but steady, like the outline of a mountain before dawn. The outline of that plan stayed with me as I moved through the house, faint at first, then clearer with each step. I went into the bedroom and knelt beside the cedar chest where I kept things I did not open often. The hinges creaked when I lifted the lid, releasing the faint scent of old wood and lavender sachets my mother tucked inside decades ago. I pushed aside folded quilts, a stack of letters tied with ribbon, a small tin box of photographs, until I reached the narrow envelope I had not touched in years. Michael's handwriting ran across the front in blue ink softened with time. My breath caught the moment I saw it. I sat down on the floor and rested the envelope on my knees before sliding the letter out carefully, afraid it might tear after so many years untouched. The paper felt thin, fragile, warm in places where my hand shook against it. I read the first line and felt the ache bloom behind my ribs. The ache I always felt when his voice found me again through ink and memory. If I am gone before you, promise me you will protect the land. I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. The room grew quiet, the kind of quiet filled with the steady hum of old grief rising from places you thought were sealed. I kept reading. He wrote about the years we spent building this life, about the way our son used to run the length of the meadow, about how the land had held our family together when everything else felt impossible. He wrote about legacy, not as money or property, but as a place where memories root themselves the way trees root in soil. He wrote that someday Evan might forget why the land mattered, but that I would remember for both of us. Sometimes it is easier to remember pain than to speak it. At the end, he had written one simple sentence, almost an afterthought: "Keep it safe, even if the world tries to take it." My throat tightened. I pressed the letter to my chest and sat very still until the shaking in my arms eased. When I finally folded it back into the envelope, I felt steadier, like something inside me had clicked into alignment. I returned everything to the cedar chest except the letter, that I kept in my hand as I walked into the living room and stood before the large window overlooking the back acreage. The trees swayed gently in the early afternoon wind, the same trees Michael planted with Evan the year before he died. Evan had been 10 then, small for his age, excited to help dig the holes even though the shovel was almost taller than he was. For a moment, I let myself imagine that version of him standing beside me again, dirt on his hands, pride in his eyes. But that memory dissolved quickly, replaced by the sound of his voice yesterday, talking about profit margins and business plans as if this land were nothing but space waiting to be sold. I looked down at Michael's letter again, tracing the edges with my fingers. That was when I remembered the old box in the closet. Not the cedar chest, but the metal file box I kept tucked behind winter boots and spare blankets. I had not opened it since the year Evan left for college. I went to the hall closet and pulled the box out, brushing off a thin layer of dust. Inside were documents I had gathered over decades: land maps, deeds, notarized surveys, copies of boundary lines going back to the late 70s. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor and went through them one by one, spreading them around me like pieces of a puzzle. It took time, but it calmed me. The act of touching these papers felt like anchoring myself to something solid, something older than the chaos the past few days had stirred. I found the file I was looking for near the bottom, a manila folder labeled Conservation Options, written in my own handwriting and forgotten long ago. The pages inside were from a meeting Michael and I once had with a preservation group that visited rural counties, teaching families how to protect land from future commercial development. We had only been curious then. We never imagined we would need it. I ran my fingers over the page describing permanent easements, how they safeguarded land indefinitely, how no future heirs or buyers could undo the restrictions, how they preserved nature long after the person who initiated them was gone. The idea settled into me with a deep, resonant certainty, a certainty I had not felt in days, maybe years. I take another breath, heavier this time, and open my eyes. The house was quiet, almost reverent, as if it knew I had reached something important. I gathered the folder and Michael's letter and placed them gently on the dining table. I made tea to steady my hands, though I barely tasted it. I spent the next hour reading every page carefully, letting the meaning of each line settle into my mind. When the tea was gone and the room had grown still again, I finally picked up my phone. My fingers hovered above the screen for a moment before I found the number I needed. Harold answered on the third ring. His voice was calm, warm, the exact opposite of the turmoil in my chest. I asked him if he had time to talk today. He said he always had time for me. So I told him everything. Not about the rehearsal or the wedding, not about the humiliation. Those parts hardly mattered now. What mattered was the plan Sienna and her uncle were forming. What mattered was the pressure Evan was under. What mattered was the land, and the urgency blooming around it like smoke from a fire not yet visible. When I finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. I could hear papers shifting on his desk. the faint creak of his leather chair. Finally, he said there were legal ways to protect the land if I was truly ready to do that. He said the option depended on how permanent I wanted the protection to be. I told him permanence was the only thing that made sense now. He asked me again if I was certain. I closed my eyes and let the memory of Michael's handwriting pass through me. Then I said, yes, I am certain. I am. Harold said he could begin drafting documents today, but that I should review the long-term consequences before finalizing anything. He said this choice would reshape every inheritance plan I ever had for Evan. He wanted me to walk into it with clarity, not emotion. I thanked him and told him I would come in to talk in person. He said to bring any documents I thought might help. He said he would make time. After the call, I set the phone down and exhaled. The air felt easier to breathe than it had in days. I gathered the conservation options folder, Michael's letter, and the land records spread across the table. I stacked them neatly, smoothing the edges before placing a rubber band around them. That was the moment it began, I say, or maybe the moment I finally saw what had been building for months. The sun had lowered a little, casting warm stripes across the floor. I walked outside for a moment and stood on the back porch. A soft breeze moved across the field, carrying the scent of wild grass. The trees at the far edge swayed in unison, steady, grounded, unbothered by whatever storms the world might bring. I felt something shift inside me again, but this time it was not fear or heartbreak. It was resolve, a quiet, unwavering resolve that rooted itself somewhere deep. The land would be safe. I would make sure of it. When I stepped back inside the house, carrying the folder to the entry table so I would not forget it in the morning, I felt calmer, not because the problem was solved, but because I finally knew where to begin. I turned off the lights one by one as evening settled around the house. The meadow outside darkened in slow waves. The quiet felt different now, not like a warning, like preparation. And when I went to bed that night, the last thought I had before sleep found me was simple and steady, like a promise whispered to the land itself. I am not losing you. Morning light filtered through the curtains when I opened my eyes, soft and pale, like the beginning of something I could not yet name. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, letting my thoughts settle into place. The decision I had made the night before held steady inside me, firm as bedrock. I got dressed, gathered the folder from the entry table, tucked Michael's letter inside it for strength, and drove toward town. The road into Silver Ridge curved along the edge of the valley, the kind of drive that usually calmed me, not today. My hand stayed tight around the steering wheel, and my foot tapped lightly against the floorboard, as if impatience could push the car faster. I reached the law office 15 minutes early and sat in the parking lot until the clock on the dashboard clicked forward. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of lemon polish and old files. Harold stepped out from his office the moment he heard me, holding a mug of coffee in one hand and giving me that gentle, steady look that always made me feel less alone. He took the folder from me, set it on his desk, and asked if I slept at all. I told him I slept better than I had the night before, which was the truth. He sat across from me and opened the folder slowly, reading through the land records, the conservation packet, and finally the letter from Michael. When he reached the last line, he closed it softly. Harold nods gently. He understands that families break slowly, then suddenly. He said it was clear I had been carrying this weight longer than I realized. I let out a breath I had been holding for days. He explained what the next steps could be. The process for an irrevocable conservation easement, the legal protections it would provide, the restrictions it would impose, the permanence of it. He did not soften his wording. He did not try to persuade me. He laid out the facts plainly, respectfully, like someone placing tools on a table and letting me choose which ones I needed. When he finished, he looked at me closely. He said that once the easement was filed, even Evan would have no legal ground to challenge it. He said this was not about punishment, it was about protection. But people would treat it as both. My throat tightened a little. I told him I understood. I told him that sometimes protection looks like punishment to those who do not believe they need protecting. He nodded, then reached for a stack of sample documents. He walked me through the language, land boundary descriptions, development restrictions, environmental commitments, donation clauses, filing procedures with the State Conservation Board. His voice was steady, firm, grounding. When he was done, he folded his hands atop the papers and said that timing mattered. If the Hartman family was already speaking to the county about development, I needed to move quickly. He told me he had seen situations like this before, not identical, but close. And in every one of them, delay was the tool of those who wanted leverage. The word made my stomach twist. I asked him if I should be worried about pressure from Evan and Sienna. He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it, and said they had already begun applying pressure the moment they stepped into my kitchen, demanding my signature. Then he leaned forward slightly and added something I had never expected to hear. He said their visit, the documents they brought, and the tactics they used could potentially fall under elder financial exploitation if pushed further. Not because I was helpless, but because I was being coerced. The law recognizes coercion long before people do, he said. And then he asked if I still had the email Sienna had sent. When I told him yes, he asked me to forward it. He read it twice, then shook his head slowly. He said the language was not incriminating on its own, but it painted a picture. And pictures can be powerful in court if things ever went that far. Outside, thunder rumbles in the distance. Low and warning, the kind that rolls across the valley before the real storm arrives. My mother used to say thunder was just the sky clearing its throat, preparing to speak. Then he asked the question that mattered more than all the rest. Are you ready for what this will mean for your relationship with your son? My breath caught, not because I did not know the answer, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it real. I told him the truth, that my relationship with Evan had been drifting for years, that the wedding door had not been the beginning, that his silence during the rehearsal had not surprised me, that I had been losing him by inches long before Sienna came into the picture, and that the land was the one thing I could not lose along with him. Harold sat back and nodded, not with judgment, but with understanding. He said he would begin the paperwork today, draft the easement documents using the land records I brought, and prepare everything for my signature. He said that once I signed, he would notarize the packet and file it with the state within 24 hours. When we finished reviewing everything, he closed the folder and said something reassuring in the way only someone who has lived through decades of human conflict can say it. He told me people show who they are when money enters the room. And the moment he said it, I felt something click inside me, clear and sharp. I thanked him and stood to leave. He walked me to the door, resting one hand lightly on the frame. He asked me to prepare myself for a reaction when Evan learned about the easement. He said sons do not react well to losing something they believe they are entitled to, especially when they do not understand what entitlement actually means. Outside, the sun had risen high, warming the concrete steps as I descended. I felt lighter somehow, not because the problem was solved, but because I was no longer bracing myself in the dark. The decision had shape now, structure, law, and that made it feel less like a secret war in my chest and more like a path I could follow. When I pulled into my driveway back home, I saw an unfamiliar car parked near the porch, a dark sedan with tinted windows. My pulse quickened as I parked beside it. Before I even stepped out of my Subaru, I recognized the man standing near the front steps. I set the pen down, folding my hands so they stopped trembling. I can feel something shifting inside me. The same feeling I had the day everything changed. The day the truth landed so hard it almost knocked the air out of me. It was Mark Richter, an attorney known around town for handling difficult cases. He turned toward me with a polite smile, the kind that looked practiced rather than sincere. He greeted me using my full name and handed me a business card before I had even reached the porch. He said he represented the Hartman family and wanted to discuss some concerns they had about my recent behavior. My breath stalled for a moment, but I kept my face still. He used careful legal phrasing. He said I had responsibilities as a parent and future grandmother. He said cooperation was expected in matters that affected the well-being of the next generation. Then he hinted that refusing to sign property documents could create conflict that would reflect poorly on me. His tone slipped at one point, just slightly, revealing the pressure behind the polite mask. I asked if Evan had sent him. He said he could not disclose that, which of course meant yes. I told him nothing was being signed that day. His smile tightened. He said delay was not in my best interest. I said delay was my right. He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand and asked him to leave my property. He hesitated like he wanted to continue the conversation, then finally nodded and said he would follow up. He returned to his car and drove away slowly, as if hoping I would run after him. I did not. When he was gone, I stood on the porch for a long moment, feeling the wind lift the edge of my shirt and carry the scent of pine from the fields. A hawk circled above the ridge, silent and steady, its wings cutting through the sky in wide arcs. The land was watching. The land had always been watching. And the weight of what I needed to do pressed deeper into place. Before I sign anything, I say softly, I need you to understand exactly why I cannot let them touch that land. Not now, not ever. I went inside and closed the door gently behind me, letting the quiet settle again. I knew the Hartmans would come at me harder now. I knew Evan would call soon, hurt and angry, repeating words that were not fully his own. But I also knew this was the moment everything shifted. The moment before the storm tightens. The moment before the decision becomes irreversible. The moment a mother stops trying to be understood and starts standing her ground. I stood there in the quiet house long enough to hear my own heartbeat steady itself, slow and deliberate, like it was preparing me for what would come next. The visit from Mark Richter had confirmed what I already suspected. They were not going to wait patiently for my decision. They were going to push. They were going to insist. They were going to corner me until I bent. But they had underestimated something. A mother who has lost enough will eventually stop breaking. Late afternoon light stretched across the wood floor as I walked toward the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and drank half of it just to settle my nerves. I had barely set the glass down when gravel crunched outside, loud and too close. I froze. A car door slammed. Then another. Footsteps came up the porch. I already knew who it was. I could feel the pressure before I heard the knock. I opened the door, and there they stood. Evan in a wrinkled button-down, looking tired and strained, and Sienna beside him in a fitted wool coat despite the warm air. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it lifted the corners of her eyes, and she wore that same thin smile I had come to recognize. A smile that did not greet. A smile that declared. Harold nods again, leaning back slightly, giving me space. I did not invite them in, but Evan stepped inside anyway, folding his hands together as if trying to find a polite version of a confrontation. Sienna walked in slower, surveying my living room like a real estate agent evaluating a property. She looked at the mantel, The old frame photos, the worn rug. Her lips curved slightly, but not in kindness. I asked what they wanted. Sienna did not wait for Evan to answer. "We need your signature today." Evan flinched at her bluntness, but he stayed silent. I told them I had spoken to my attorney already. I said nothing would be decided today. I said I needed time. Sienna laughed under her breath, the kind of soft, dismissive sound that pricks the skin. She said time was exactly what they did not have. She said they had already submitted preliminary paperwork to the county for their business proposal. She said delays could set them back months. I asked her what kind of paperwork she meant. She lifted her chin and said something I will never forget. We filed for early review of our development concept. 5 cabins, a communal lodge, a wellness deck overlooking the meadow. We asked them to begin assessing environmental impact. My jaw clenched. Evan shifted nervously, rubbing the back of his neck the way he used to when he was a teenager caught lying about curfew. "Take your time," he says. I asked her how she could file plans on land that was not hers. Her smile widened just enough to reveal the cruelty beneath it. "It will be ours soon. The county understands that." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "The county cannot approve development without the property owner." She blinked slowly, as if talking to a child. "They can start the review, and once your signature is in place, everything will transition smoothly." Evan cleared his throat, voice thin. "Mom, we are not trying to fight. We are trying to build something for our future, for the family we want to have someday." I stared at him, my son, the boy who used to run through these fields with arms spread like wings, the young man Michael had been so proud of. And now he stood in my living room asking me to erase the very ground that shaped him. "You are talking about tearing down the barn your father built with his own hands," I said. "You are talking about paving over the grass you played on as a child. You are talking about bulldozing memories you do not even remember having." Silence settled between us, thick and heavy. Evan looked at the floor. Sienna looked at me. Only one of them understood exactly what I was saying, and it was not my son. Harold looks at me softly. He is 65 and has the kind of eyes that say he has seen every family fall apart at least once. He rests one hand on the stack of documents between us. Irrevocable conservation easement. Even the title feels final, permanent. A gate that closes only one way. For the first time since entering this office, I feel the words coming, rising, pulling me back into the memory I have tried to outrun for weeks. I am not ready to sign yet, but I am ready to start telling the story of how I got here. Sienna stepped forward until she stood only a foot away from me. Her voice softened, but it did not warm. "You are one person living on 32 acres. That is not practical. That is selfish. We could turn this land into something meaningful instead of letting it sit there like a museum to your grief." My breath caught. For a heartbeat, I could not speak. The cruelty was not accidental. It was intentional. She had gone through my home earlier, and she had seen Michael's photo on the mantel. She knew exactly which wound she had aimed for. I steadied myself against the edge of the table. "Evan," I said, "please tell me this is not what you believe." He looked up, eyes shining with something between shame and frustration. "Mom, please, just listen. I am trying to balance 2 people I love. I cannot keep being pulled apart. If you just sign the transfer, everything becomes easier." "Easier for who?" I asked. He opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Sienna took over again. She said her uncle had investors already lined up. She said this project could bring in revenue none of us had seen before. She said she and Evan were trying to build a life, not cling to the past. Then she leaned forward, voice dropping low. I take another breath, steady this time. "And the truth is, Marilyn, this land is too much for you. It is too much work, too much risk, too much responsibility. If you refuse to sign, it will only get harder for everyone." I stared at her for several long seconds, the anger rising not as heat but as clarity, sharp, focused, cold. Get out. Sienna blinked. Evan's head jerked up. I said it again, each word steadier than the last. Get out. Evan stepped forward, panic in his voice. Mom, wait. We can talk about this. We can fix this. You stood silent while your wife spoke to me like a stranger stealing something she was entitled to. You filed plans behind my back. You pushed me out of your wedding. And now you want me to hand over the only place I have left. There is nothing to fix. Sienna reached for her purse, muttering that I was being unreasonable. Evan looked torn in half, but he did not stop her. They walked to the door together, and for a moment I saw my son glance back, as if searching for the right words to make me change my mind. But none came. It began 3 weeks ago at the rehearsal, and if you want to understand today, you need to see exactly what happened there. Sienna stepped outside first. Evan lingered just long enough to say he hoped I would do the right thing. I told him I already had. He swallowed hard and followed her. Their car door slammed. Gravel spun under their tires. And then they were gone, the dust rising behind them like smoke. I closed the door softly, not because I felt fragile, but because I felt something inside me settle with finality. I walked to the living room window and watched the meadow glow under the late sun. The trees swayed, tall and steady, untroubled by the turmoil in my kitchen. The land had held my family for generations, and now it was telling me, in the quiet way land knows how to speak, that it was time I held it back. I rested my hand on the glass and let the cool surface ground me. Tomorrow I would sign whatever Harold prepared. Tonight, I would prepare myself for the storm that would follow. The house felt strangely still the next morning, as if it had taken a long breath while I slept and was waiting for me to do the same. I woke before sunrise, my body already aware of the weight of the day ahead. I dressed slowly, choosing the navy sweater Michael always said brought out the steadiness in my eyes. I tied my hair back, made coffee I barely drank, and gathered the folder Harold had prepared. The air outside was cool, almost sharp. Mist hovered low over the meadow, brushing the tops of the grasses like the land was whispering something only the morning could understand. I locked the door behind me and stood for a moment on the porch, letting the sights settle into me. This view, this stillness, this place. I was doing this for all of it. The drive into town felt shorter than usual. My hands stayed steady on the wheel. No tremor, no hesitation. I parked in front of Harold's office exactly at 8:30, stepped out, and walked inside. I glanced again at the pen, sitting quietly on the desk between us, waiting for me to gather the strength to lift it. Harold looked up from his desk when I entered, his eyes warm with a quiet understanding I did not know how much I needed until that moment. He asked if I was ready. I told him yes, and this time the word did not catch in my throat. He spread the documents across the desk, the easement, the land description, the notarization page, the witness signature line. He explained each one again, not because he doubted me, but because he respected the gravity of what I was about to do. Then he handed me a pen, not heavy, not light, ordinary, but my hand tightened around it as if recognizing its purpose. I signed my name, Marilyn Grace Carter. Each letter felt deliberate, permanent. By the fourth signature, my heartbeat had steadied into something calm, like stepping into a place that already knew I belonged. Harold added his own signature after each one, the movements crisp and certain. When he finished, he gathered the papers, tapped them neatly on the desk, slid them into an envelope, and sealed it with a single firm press. "It is done," he said softly. I exhaled a breath I had been holding for years. He told me he would file the easement with the State Conservation Board by noon. He said that by end of day, the land would be legally protected. No development, no sale, no transfer, no loopholes, no exceptions. My phone buzzed in my purse, but I ignored it. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tightness in my chest ease. Harold asked if I wanted a moment alone before leaving. I shook my head. I wanted to get home, to stand on the porch with the land in full view and let the enormity of what I had done settle into the soil alongside everything else this place had held for decades. I thanked him and stepped outside. The rain outside grows louder, as if urging me on. The rain outside grows louder, as if urging me on, and the memory rises so quickly it feels like the door of that ballroom swings open in front of me again. The sky had brightened. The wind smelled of pine and something almost sweet. I walked to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and had barely closed the door before the phone buzzed again. Evan, then again, faster this time. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. My voice came out steady, surprising even myself. He sounded frantic. He said he had spoken to Sienna's uncle and found out the county needed my signature for the next phase. He said they had investors waiting. He said I needed to send the deed today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. I did not interrupt. I let him talk until the words began repeating themselves, looping through panic and pressure and entitlement like they always did when he felt something slipping beyond his reach. When he finally paused, I asked quietly if he had come to this realization on his own or if Sienna was standing beside him telling him what to say. He snapped that it did not matter. Then he said something that made the calm inside me deepen, almost settle into steel. I had arrived early that afternoon, earlier than I needed to, because that is what mothers do when they want everything to go smoothly for their children. The parking lot beside the Denver venue was already filling with cars, all shining from a fresh wash, all carrying people who belonged there. I sat in my old Subaru a moment longer, smoothing the skirt of my soft blue dress, reminding myself that this was supposed to be a happy weekend. Evan was getting married, my only child, my heart in human form. He told me he had been trying to be patient, that he had asked nicely, that if I cared about his future at all, I would stop making everything difficult. Michael's letter flashed through my mind. Keep it safe, even if the world tries to take it. I took a slow breath and looked through the windshield at the mountains rising beyond the town. They stood quiet and anchored, the way the land always did. And I told Evan there was something he needed to understand. I told him to listen carefully because I would only say it once. He fell quiet immediately. I could hear his breathing on the other end, quick, uneven. I said 4 words. It is not yours. There was a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse. Then he asked what I meant, his voice cracking at the edges like something inside him had been struck. I repeated myself slower this time. Inside the lobby, soft music floated from the ballroom. Voices rose and fell in waves, the kind of laughter that comes easily when people are celebrating and not worrying who might be standing on the outside of the door. It is not yours. He asked if I had sold it. He asked if I had given it to someone else. He asked if I had done something behind his back. His voice rose in panic, tripping over questions before he could finish one. I closed my eyes and finally said what needed to be said. I signed an irrevocable conservation easement this morning. The land now belongs to the trust. It cannot be developed. It cannot be sold. It cannot be transferred, not to you, not to anyone. It is protected. It always will be. There was no sound on the other end at first. Not breathing, not movement, just stunned silence. Then I heard him inhale sharply, a sound I remembered from when he was small and accidentally broke something he could not repair. Mom, no, please no, you cannot do that. You cannot. You had no right. That is my inheritance. It is supposed to be mine. My voice stayed level. It was never yours. It was mine. It was your father's. It was your grandfather's. It was entrusted to this family long before you learned the meaning of the word future. He tried to interrupt, but I kept speaking. And you pushed me out of your wedding. You brought a lawyer into my home. You stood silent while your wife treated me like an obstacle. You wanted the land because it served your plans, not because you valued it, not because you valued me. I took a breath and reached for the handle. He begged. He pleaded. He said he was sorry. He said he had made mistakes. He said he was just trying to build something. He said he did not know Sienna had filed county paperwork without telling him. For a moment, his voice cracked in a way that almost sounded like the boy I once held when thunderstorms shook the house. Mom, please undo it. Please, I will fix everything. I swear, just undo it. My heart tightened, but my resolve did not. I said it cannot be undone, and even if it could, I would not. There was a long pause. Then he whispered something I will never forget. You chose land over your son. I wiped a tear from my cheek before it could fall. No, I said softly, I chose what was worth protecting. There was another silence, one that felt much heavier than the first. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone and sat back in the car, letting the quiet fill the space where his voice had been. My hands trembled as the adrenaline drained from my body. I inhaled deeply and closed my eyes. The moment I stepped toward the ballroom, the door opened from the inside. And there she was, Sienna. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture. She filled the doorway like she owned the entire building. The deed was done, the land was safe. But the storm I had prepared for was only just beginning. The quiet inside the car pressed in on me after the call ended, settling in my chest like a weight I had been carrying for far longer than just these past few weeks. I sat there until my breathing found its rhythm again, slow and steady. Then I started the engine and drove home through a wash of sunlight that felt too calm for the storm still ringing in my ears. By the time I reached my driveway, the shadows were stretching long across the property. The house stood still in the afternoon light, unchanged by all that had happened, unshaken by the upheaval in my family. The land rarely reacted to human chaos. It simply waited, patient and ancient, while people like me tried to find our footing. Inside, the house felt warm, the kind of warm that comes from years of footsteps and laughter, and long nights spent beside someone you loved. I took off my sweater, draped it over the back of a chair, and stood in the living room, listening to the tick of the old wall clock. My hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of something that had been wound tight for too long. For the rest of the evening, the phone stayed silent. No calls, no texts, no messages from numbers I did not recognize. I knew that silence did not mean surrender. It meant regrouping. It meant they were figuring out what had happened and what they wanted to do next. I made dinner but barely ate it. I washed the dishes, wiped down the counter, and walked to the back porch with a cup of tea. Dusk settled over the meadow like a soft blanket. Fireflies flickered near the fence line, bright and brief. I felt a calm rise inside me that I had not felt in years, a calm rooted in the certainty that I had protected something worth protecting. For the first time since the rehearsal in Denver, I slept deeply, without waking to the thrum of worry in my chest. 2 days passed before the first email arrived from a lawyer representing Sienna and her uncle. It accused me of acting in bad faith. It suggested the easement was a spiteful act. It insisted I reverse the donation immediately. I forwarded it to Harold with a note asking whether I should even bother reading messages like that. He replied within minutes, telling me he would handle everything and that I should not respond. More emails came, some threatening, some pleading, then voicemails, long and angry, promising consequences. I deleted each one without listening all the way through. After a week, The tone shifted again. A softer voicemail. Evan's voice cracked, tired, worn from arguments I knew he was having behind closed doors. He begged me to reconsider. He said he could not lose everything at once. He said he was sorry, then said he was angry, then said he did not know what else to do. Her eyes moved over me in one clean sweep, not shocked, not annoyed, just cold, as if she had expected this moment and rehearsed exactly how she wanted it to go. I let it play until the end, then set the phone down. Each day afterward brought fewer messages than none. Winter rolled in early that year. Snow settled across the field in quiet stretches, frosting the fence posts and gathering under the oak trees. The world seemed to hold its breath. I spent long mornings sweeping the porch, brushing snow off the railing with my gloves, watching my breath rise in thin clouds. One morning in early January, I was in Harold's office reviewing some final language the Conservation Board had approved when he mentioned something in the calm, matter-of-fact tone he used for difficult truths. Sienna had been sued by a former client for mismanagement of funds. The case had gone public, nothing damaging to me, but enough to tarnish her reputation. Investors had backed out. The cabin project collapsed before it even began. Then he said something else. Evan had filed for separation. I sat very still. Not triumphant, not wounded, just still. Harold watched me for a moment before gently sliding another document across the desk to sign. He did not speak again until I stood to leave. He touched my shoulder lightly. Life has its own accounting, he said. It all balances eventually. On the drive home, the road felt quieter than usual. The weight of everything that had happened rested in my chest. But it was not the crushing weight of regret. It was the solemn weight of acceptance. A few weeks later, a handwritten envelope appeared in my mailbox. I recognized the slant of Evan's writing immediately. I took it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from something closer to grief, softened over time. The letter was long, written without crossed-out words or corrections, as if he had poured everything out in one sitting. He said he was ashamed. He said he had been blind. He said he had allowed someone else to tell him who to be and what to want. He said he understood now that the land held more than soil and timber. It held the years of a family trying to build something that lasted. He said he did not expect forgiveness. He hoped for it, but he did not expect it. He said he loved me. And then he wrote a line that made me lower the letter to the table and press my hand against my chest. He says, "My job is not to push you. My job is to make sure you understand exactly what this means. Once you sign, Marilyn, the land will be protected forever. No development, no transfer, no loans, no one, not even your family, can reverse it." She put one hand out, palm toward my chest, stopping me before I could take another step. It was not forceful, but it was final. He said he finally understood that protecting something sacred does not mean choosing it over a person. It means refusing to let a person destroy what was never theirs to take. I sat there until the sun shifted across the floor and the shadows moved. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the cedar chest where Michael's letter rested. Side by side, past and present, both written by the men who shaped my heart. Spring arrived early that year. Buds broke along the branches. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing soil. The meadow breathed again, full and bright. I began volunteering with a youth program that brought city kids to rural land for weekend retreats. Groups of them came to visit the property, running through the grass, pointing out hawks in the sky, laughing as they learned to identify pine scents or animal tracks near the creek bed. Each time they visited, I felt something inside me settle more deeply, as if the land itself was showing me the next chapter of its story. One afternoon in May, a little girl tugged on my sleeve and asked how long the trees had been growing. I told her they were planted long before she was born, before her parents were born too. She stared up at them with eyes wide, as if she were witnessing something both ordinary and miraculous. She said they must be the luckiest trees in the world to have someone who cared enough to protect them. Her words held a simplicity that pierced right through me. I looked out across the meadow, feeling the wind against my face and the warmth of the sun settling on my shoulders. I knew then, more clearly than I ever had, that everything I had done was not just for me. It was not even just for Michael or my parents. It was for anyone who ever needed a place that stayed safe, no matter how the world around it changed. A refuge, a promise, a legacy that no one could weaponize or take. Some of you listening have lived through something similar. You have been pushed aside. You have been told you are difficult. You have been asked to give and give until there is nothing left. And somewhere along the way, you learned that protecting what matters often means standing alone. This rehearsal is for wedding party only. She did not say my name. She did not even pretend to smile. She just looked at me the way you look at a stranger you want to keep outside your fence. I want to know what you would have done in my place. Would you have signed the easement or chosen a different path? Share your thoughts. Tell me your own stories, and stay with me for the next chapter. There is more to say, and I would love for you to be here when I do. I blinked, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. Evan told me yesterday he wanted this rehearsal simple. I thought I would just sit in the back. She tilted her head slightly, like she was studying something unpleasant under a bright light. My planner told me to keep stress low today. Having extra people in the room throws off the schedule. I need everything perfect for tomorrow. People inside the ballroom were starting to glance our way. A few of the bridesmaids whispered behind shiny hair and dangling earrings. I forced a small breath. I only wanted to watch. I am not here to interfere. I already made adjustments to the guest workflow. It is better if you sit this out. Her voice never rose. It was flat, smooth, clean, like a sheet of ice. Then Evan appeared behind her. For a heartbeat, I felt relief. He would smile, touch my arm, pull me inside. He would ease whatever tension she was trying to create. He had always been that kind of boy, tender in small moments. I waited for that softness now, but he did not step between us. He did not even meet my eyes. I nod, but my throat feels tight and dry. Rain streaks across the window, cutting the reflection of my own face in uneven lines. I see a woman who looks older than she felt yesterday. I smooth a stray strand of hair behind my ear and press my fingertips into the cool edge of the desk, trying to ground myself. The wood is smooth from decades of elbows and papers and lives that passed through this office before mine. Hey, he said it softly, and I felt the air go thin around us. A bridesmaid at the registration table let out a quiet sigh, as if she had seen this exact scene before. I said I can sit in the back. Evan, I will not get in the way, I promise. Sienna looked at him. Just a glance. It was enough. His shoulders tightened. Mom, not today. It is better if you let them rehearse without distractions. The word distractions hit me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I knew if I spoke right then, my voice might shake, and I refused to give either of them that. Sienna stepped slightly forward, positioning her body so she blocked the doorway completely. We want tomorrow peaceful. Please do not take this personally. Of course it was personal. Everything about it was personal. But there's a special kind of humiliation that comes when someone treats you as if your pain is simply you being dramatic. I nodded once, though my throat was tightening. Another buzz. Evan again. I understand. I will see you tomorrow. A tiny smile flickered across Sienna's lips, polite and victorious all at once. almost rehearsed. Evan finally looked at me. Not long, not with warmth, just enough to say he had done his part. Then he turned back to the room, letting the door fall shut between us. It clicked with a sound I felt in my chest. I stood in that lobby longer than I meant to. Servers carried trays past me without slowing. Someone tested a microphone inside and music swelled, muffled but still bright. The air smelled of perfume and new carpet and the faint scent of florist boxes filled with white roses. I had imagined I would be standing inside that room, arranging boutonnieres or hugging old friends of Evan's. Instead, I stood alone under a chandelier that cast a light sharp enough to make the edges of everything feel too real. My hands trembled slightly when I reached for my purse. I tried telling myself it was not a big deal. Rehearsal was for the wedding party. After all, maybe she was just stressed. Brides get that way. Maybe tomorrow would be different, but my chest still ached as I walked back to my car. Outside, the sun was bright. Cars passed by, windows rolled down, people laughing, living lives that did not include moments like this. I slid into the driver's seat and rested both hands on the steering wheel until the shaking stopped. I reminded myself that tomorrow was what mattered. Tomorrow I would see my son get married. Tomorrow, I told myself, no one would turn me away. But all the way home, something heavy sat at the base of my stomach, the kind of heaviness that knows what the mind refuses to admit. Harold does not scold, he simply waits, patient. Lawyers know the value of silence better than anyone. When I pulled onto the highway, I replayed the moment Sienna raised her hand, the way she used her body to block the door, the way Evan disappeared behind her like a man who had already chosen which world he belonged to. I kept telling myself it was rehearsal, only rehearsal, nothing final. But deep down, I felt the truth rising, slow and steady, like the thunderheads that gather over the Rockies long before the storm breaks. I watched the road stretch out ahead of me, and beneath the hum of the engine, a small voice whispered that tomorrow might not be any kinder. I tightened my grip on the wheel. I needed to believe my son still saw me. I needed to believe Sienna's smile was stress, not cruelty. I needed to believe the world I had built for 28 years was not unraveling at the edges. But the memory of that closed door followed me all the way back to Silver Ridge. Sitting beside me in the passenger seat like a shadow I did not invite. When I pulled into my gravel driveway, the mountains rising behind the house glowed in the fading light. Normally, that sight settled me, but that evening, even the familiar outline of the hills felt uncertain, as if I had returned to a life I no longer recognized. I climbed out of the car, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. The silence wrapped around me, soft and complete. A silence that should have comforted, but instead made the loneliness inside me echo louder. The rehearsal had ended hours ago, probably with applause and smiles and champagne toasts. Inside my home, only the quiet waited. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, washed my hands out of habit, and stared at the window as twilight deepened. My reflection stared back at me, not broken, not yet, but cracked, like glass that had taken the first hit and knew another was coming. I set the phone face down. I pressed my palm against the countertop to steady myself. Then I walked into the living room and let my body sink into Michael's old armchair. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar and the cologne he used when he wanted to feel presentable. A soft ache filled my chest. The rehearsal had not destroyed me, but it had warned me. Something was coming, something I had not prepared for, something that would make even the sting of that closed door feel small. And sitting alone in that quiet room, I felt the first tremor of it moving toward me, steady as thunder rolling over the mountains. Morning came without mercy. I woke with that same heaviness in my chest, a quiet reminder that yesterday had not been a nightmare or a misunderstanding. It had happened. Sienna had stopped me at the door. Evan had let her, and today was the wedding itself. I stood at my kitchen sink sipping coffee that tasted faintly metallic from a pot I had not washed as well as I thought. Outside, the early sun touched the tops of the pines and spread across the meadow like it had every morning for the past 40 years. Nothing out there looked different, and yet everything inside me felt unsteady. I kept telling myself that yesterday was rehearsal. Rehearsals are messy. People are stressed. Maybe today would be better. Maybe Sienna would smile and say she had not meant any of it. Maybe Evan would apologize in that quiet voice he used when he was younger, when he would sit beside me on the couch with scraped knees and say he had acted without thinking. Hope is a stubborn thing, especially in a mother. By 9:30, I had convinced myself to try again. I chose a different dress, a soft gray, A-line with pearl buttons. Something understated, something that said I was not there to cause waves. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have, smoothing the fabric, practicing a smile that looks supportive instead of fragile. He asks, "Do you want some water? You look like you might need a minute." The drive to Denver felt shorter this time. My hands did not shake on the wheel. I was not walking into rehearsal. I was walking into my son's wedding. It was supposed to matter. It was supposed to hold space for me. Traffic crawled near the venue, but eventually I turned into the same parking lot where I had sat just yesterday. Rows of cars gleamed in the bright Colorado sun. Guests in pastel dresses and dark suits walked toward the entrance carrying gift bags and purses that looked like they belonged to people who did not worry about how others treated them. I took a breath, stepped out of my Subaru, and walked toward the building. The glass doors swung open easily. No one stopped me in the lobby. For a moment, my shoulders loosened. Inside, the sound of a string quartet drifted from the ceremony hall. Guests moved in gentle waves, greeting one another, laughing quietly. I saw a few familiar faces from Evan's college years. They smiled politely, but did not come closer. I scanned the room for Evan, but did not see him. It was not until I reached the inner doorway that I felt the shift. The air changed first. People went still, not dramatically, just enough that I could sense the pause in their conversations. A bridesmaid whispered something to the maid of honor, who glanced at me, then looked away too quickly. Then Sienna appeared. She stepped out from behind a tall floral arrangement, the kind with white lilies and eucalyptus that smell clean and expensive. Her wedding dress was fitted lace, soft and elegant, and she carried herself like someone who believed every camera lens belonged to her. Her eyes landed on me, and the smile on her face faded like someone had turned down a dimmer switch. "You came." Her voice was smooth but sharpened at the edges. I hesitated only a moment. I did not want drama. I did not want a scene. I only wanted to see my son get married,